biggest piece of advice is to calm down. I think everybody is as worried that their fear of missing out, that their competitors are going to get some kind of a system running before they do, and they're going to get wiped out of the market. Understand your own requirements, and also understand which one of the requirements in business problems that you have that are solvable using AI and which ones are not. And guarantee it's not as many as you think.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Manoj Tandon. Welcome to another episode of Dark Rhiino Security, Security Confidential. We have another fantastic guest today. Before I announce him, though, I got to remind you to please hit the like and subscribe button. Show us a little bit of love so we can keep bringing you this great content. But without further delay, we're honored to have David Linthicum join us today. He is a globally recognized AI, cloud, and cybersecurity thought leader. He has several of his own podcasts, and he has more than 30 years of experience in this field. He has advised global companies, startups, government agencies on AI strategy, cloud architecture, and digital innovation. He's a 5-time best-selling author. I'm going to talk to him a little bit about that. Former CEO and a CTO, and one of the world's most influential voices in cloud computing and artificial intelligence. We're honored to have you, David. Thank you for joining the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Give us a little bit about your background. We were talking about it off camera a little bit, but, how did you get started in this business, if you will?
Manoj, I'm very old, very, very old. I started in 1985, so I think I actually go 40 years now. And actually was hired initially out of college as an AI analyst, an AI programmer with Boeing Computer Services. I worked on Lisp and Prolog and M1 and, some of the early AI stuff.
I remember Lisp.
Yeah, it's still out there, believe it or not. And so, went through that whole thing. Was decision support stuff, and then went through a number of different jobs, different technologies. I get bored fairly quickly, and I start switching into different areas. I switched out of AI into land-based development, because the PCs were coming up at the time. I thought that was emerging technology. Switched out of that to service-oriented architecture. Switched out of that to web development. Because the web was suddenly a big thing at the time. This is in the 90s, and then switched out of that into integration focus. And so I wrote the book called Enterprise Application Integration, which took off like a rocket. That was 3 or 4 CTO gigs that I got from that. Those things lasted 3 to 4 years before we sold the company. Took my shot at being a CEO a couple of times, probably got a B+ doing that, and decided I want to do that anymore. Found my own company, sold it, went to Cloud Technology Partners as one of the founders. We sold that to HPE. Boy, this is an amazingly boring story. And then joined Deloitte, which was supposed to be my last job as a chief cloud strategy officer. Stayed there about 8 years. I retired 2 years, aged out actually, and I've been doing the influencer stuff since then. And just having a great time. Written a couple of books since then. Cloud Computing Insider and Unlocking the Power of Cloud. That's on top of the 17 I've done over the last 30 years. Still do the cloud blog on InfoWorld. Been doing that for 15 years. And do a lot of writing and speaking and, corporate events, and go to conferences when I'm invited, things like that. And then I got my 2 YouTube channels that I update 3 or 4 times a week.
That's fantastic. That's a heck of a background there, David. And how did you manage 80 years at Deloitte? Given that background, I'm surprised that I'm actually surprised that 80 years there seems like 30 years somewhere else.
Yeah, 8 years. It was Deloitte's an easy place to work. And I talked about 2 of my people who I brought in there. And another one is I went to Deloitte with a bunch of other people who came from Cloud Technology Partners. And so we kind of teamed up and worked together and, got into different areas of the firm. But as people will tell you about Deloitte, kind of once you get in there, it's easy to stay because it's, just kind of first class everything. They have a Deloitte University, they have, huge amenities, and, everything is, very much in terms of accommodating their employees, from the consultants all the way up to the partners. And so I enjoyed it. It was a lot of learning experience. I got to work with a lot of smart people, but the big thing I really loved was getting introduced to clients. So Deloitte has global 2,000 clients, and I was working with dozens of them. Had a lot of lessons learned that I couldn't learn earlier because we were focused on small, medium-sized business at Cloud Technology Partners and tech companies prior to that. So I got into working with some big, huge accounts in terms of building their cloud and AI strategies and realize they're kind of a different beast, and how to do it correctly, and how to deal with the politics within those organizations, how to deal with becoming a leader and leading organizations, matrix management, all that kind of stuff. And it was a great learning experience for me. I came out of there much smarter than when I came in.
So, looking at AI now, I've heard from people who are at Accenture, and they say there's 800,000 employees and the market's wanting them to downsize because of AI. They're saying, a lot of the roles there can now be reduced, and has apparently been punishing their stock as such. Or I don't follow them personally, but this is just what insiders have been saying. Do you see any truth to that firms like Deloitte and Accenture are going to see a big downsizing coming up here?
I think so. I even look at the analyst space. In other words, and that's what consultants are able to do. I'm just amazed at the tools that I have today where I can use them as a force multiplier to get into some larger analysis and get to larger answers in a very short period of time as a single person. As one person versus a team of individuals, management consultings that are sitting with a board of directors. But I can go obtain the data, I can analyze the data, I can figure out the trends within the data, the patterns within the data, and make pretty good predictions that would cost, probably $500,000 from McKinsey or, BCG or even Deloitte. With the tools that, sit on our desktop. And that's, generative AI, LLMs, based systems, as long as you know how to use it. You have to, spend some time training yourself on how to make it happen. So I can see how it's going to impact them. And I can see how it's going to impact also the job market, because the entry-level jobs that you're going to do are typically going to be busy work, formatting spreadsheets and things like that, and creating small tactical models. Well, AI can do that as well, if not better, and typically better, certainly if someone's trying to learn. And that's going to have to be something we're going to have to adjust to. It was funny, I put a post out today on LinkedIn, about the larger tech analyst firms. And I guess I'm in the tech analyst space, but, I'm able to use SurveyMonkey and AI to basically do reports that, provide, I think, 20 times better information, and they're not biased. In other words, I wasn't paid to come up with some sort of a narrative. And I think that's going to be a force multiplier for lots of folks out there. So I can do things better than the analyst firms out there. I can do a lot of things better than consulting firms out there, certainly the architecture stuff. And I can do it as a single human being. And so if I can do it, I'm not the smartest person in the world. There should be other folks within these businesses that realize that we're not going to need these very expensive consultants that are charging $1,000, $1,500 an hour to show up and provide, these types of services where they were needed 4 years ago.
And contrast this, because with where we came from in 1985, was this even imaginable? The world of Lisp and Prolog, and AI originated even before that in the 1950s. A lot of the mathematics was done on it. From where that was to where we are today, could you contrast that a little bit? How far we have come? Was this even imaginable?
It's funny. It was imaginable because I was in a lot of AI SIGs, special interest groups. When we didn't have the internet, we would actually get together in someone's office and meet once a month. And they were talking about AI really being 2001: A Space Odyssey, the ability to have conversations and have intelligence that really kind of rivals that of a human or exceeds that of a human. And so that was always the objective. It just, we went back and looked at our list models and went back and did some of the neural networking stuff, and it wasn't anywhere close to doing that. And by the way, it cost $1 million just to do anything of worthiness in the space in 1985. But what we did know, we knew how to do it, but we didn't have the power and the ability to spend the money to make it happen. So something like a generative AI, we couldn't contemplate it in 1985, but it would have cost trillions of dollars, to get to a computing platform that just basically acts like, GPT 3.5. And the reality is we knew about how AI could excel. We knew about some generative AI capabilities, certainly agentic. I was building AI agents in 1985, by the way. And
give us an example of that's surprising to hear. What would an agent back then have done?
There were autonomous agents that had knowledge models that are associated with it, and I used to put them in devices that were monitoring things at NASA when I was working on the shuttle payload project. And so, if they had a device that would operate in the clean room, which I was working on, and it would be basically a PC that was configured as a device, so I'd have the agents running on the device, and so they would be autonomous unto themselves. And the reason for that is the connectivity was so bad. So we didn't get about, we couldn't have networks we could depend on. And so the thing could operate any kind of a situation and make core decisions and learn as it went. That's what agents do at the end of the day. Well, now we have agents that are bound to an LLM, but they were in essence, small models that were, very tactically focused. I think I was using M1 at the time. And it was just out of necessity in terms of the architecture. I had to build these things, hundreds of these field interface devices, we call them FIDs, which had their own AI agents running on them because the networking was so unreliable and they could carry on operations even if connectivity was down. And so that was an architectural need. But I did understand at the time that was more expensive and also more complex. But we had the architecture, agentic architecture is nothing new. We've known about that for a long period of time, and I built a few of those things. So you use it, but you use it for special situations where it's going to add value. That's what, how AI should be configured. And so, when I look at an AI problem domain back then and even now, I'm trying to get by with a minimum viable technology. I'm trying to spend the least amount of money, use the simplest solution that's going to return the most value to the business. And, that's not always what the narrative talks about, but I think that's the best way to use it. And back then we did the same thing. In other words, I would not recommend agentic AI to my clients, in this case, NASA, unless there was some value in doing it. And it was based on the capability of it. He was able to turn value back to the mission. And that's, is still around today. The architecture tricks I learned, in the 80s and 90s, was foundational to my books I wrote and how I teach architecture and, the ability to kind of look at this stuff. At the end of the day, we're trying to select technology and configure technology that's going to return the most value back to the business. The technology has changed. It's gotten tremendously better. And I think that's great. We have the tools in front of us to allow this stuff to happen. But the same processes and thinking still needs to occur behind the scenes.
What was the transformation moment in modern times that's given us the rise to LLMs?
I think it was the ability to spend the money, and it was access to the processing that we didn't have. So, I saw the academic papers, and I wasn't really much into that world, but I would see them come across, in terms of talking about, they may not have mentioned generative AI, but it was basically talking about generative AI. And so they knew how to do it. And I would read those papers like, we can do this, but we're going to have to spend $500 million to build the first model. Who's willing to do that? And the reality is LLMs are so powerful because they're built with the whole of the information that's on the internet. Number one, we didn't have the internet, 20 years ago. We couldn't digitally access all these various pieces of information. Now we do. And now we have the ability to spend the money to build these very powerful models, not because they're powerful because the technology is unique, but they're powerful because of the training data that's available to them. And so it was kind of perfect storm. Someone had the money to spend, in this case, OpenAI, but there are a few other companies that were doing as well. We had the access to the information for the open internet. We're dumb enough to put everything online that, is out there that we can train from, able to crawl those spaces. And they came together and it came up with the first LLM. And that was kind of the eureka moment for them, because people who used it for the first time, they go, oh, this is something different. I can have it write a letter basically using my voice. I can generate images. I can generate music. I can generate videos. All these capabilities that we knew were going to be there. We just did not have the money, the processing power, and the access to the information that it needed to make that happen.
So GPU computing, and I guess the Transformer paper at Google was, those were, from what I have surmised, are two critical pieces that came into play that allowed us to scale these models at industrial capacity without breaking the bank. Well, you still break the bank. If you want to build a foundational model today, that's not for the faint of heart.
No. At least most of them are at least $100 million to train. And some of them can take a couple of months. I don't know what they're doing now. The benchmarks, it's changing a great deal, but only the big companies have foundational models because if they're so expensive to create them. I don't know why we need 200 of them now, which is what we have, and we get a new one every couple of months, every couple of weeks. But that was it. So in other words, we realized that was the power. We always knew there was something there. I don't think people quite imagine, how much that was going to have a far-reaching impact on us as people, the economy, kind of changing the game and reinventing the way in which we look at technology. So it's technology that from a foundational thinking point of view was always available to us. We knew it was possible to make it happen. We didn't have the money and didn't have the wherewithal to go ahead and build those models. Someone was brave enough to do it. And suddenly we have an LLMs. And once someone did it, you had 20 other people do it in the next 6 months. And you had 100 people do it in the next couple of years. And now it's at full blown blast. Anybody knows how to build an LLM. There's open models out there. You can use Llama. You can build a reasonable LLM, even on your local hardware, believe it or not. It's going to have some limitations, but we know how to do it. The cat's out of the bag. And it's just like remember the 4-minute mile? No one would break the 4-minute mile until somebody broke the 4-minute mile. And then suddenly over the next 6 months, there was hundreds of people who broke the 4-minute mile. So I think the person who is the pioneer is the person who realized I'm going to spend a lot of money, put a lot of risk involved in it, and see if we can make it happen. And guess what? It worked out. But they were built on the thoughts and the thinking and the work of thousands of scientists, thousands of college professors, thousands of people who did the research that allowed them to have the jumping off point in order to create generative AI and basically instances of generative AI that were going to be useful, namely an LLM. Well, so here we are.
Speaking of jumping off points, we come to today, and the AI world changes pretty much on a daily basis almost. As you rightfully said, we've got several models, and depending on the day of the week, one is going to surpass the other in certain capabilities. And it's a continuing race to what finish line, we don't know. But where, as a business leader, do you take your organization? Because back when there was digital transformation, that was still kind of slow. And there's still, believe it or not, people out there, David, that are still working on digital transformation. And now we're talking about AI transformation, adoption of AI in the organization. In a world that's changing faster than you can think, where do you advise a company? Where do they start? What do they do?
Number one, my biggest piece of advice is to calm down. I think everybody is worried that their fear of missing out, that their competitors are going to get some kind of a system running before they do, and they're going to get wiped out of the market. Number one, understand your own requirements, and also understand which one of the requirements in business problems that you have that are solvable using AI and which ones are not. And guarantee it's not as many as you think. So when you're looking at an enterprise problem domain, you're looking at all the systems that the enterprise is running. If you're looking at AI enhancement opportunities for those systems, that's typically going to be maybe 40% to 45%, sometimes 50% of the systems. It's not going to be everything in the enterprise. It doesn't need to be updated, doesn't need to be AI enabled. And normally it's going to be your edge applications, productivity, your ability to do scheduling, logistics management, things like that, not things that are core to your business. So figure out where you are and what you need to do. And I'm so surprised when I talk to people, they come up to me and they said, how do we do AI? And I said, well, what problems are you solving? What business are you in? What requirements? What, compliance issues are you dealing with? And where is your point of latency? And also, where do you think additional innovation or use of AI will add a force multiplier for the business? There's always something to make it happen.
How many people even know the answer to that question that you just asked?
It's just look at it with the brain of someone who understands the technology and figure out, where, one of the exercises we do in my architecture class, we read these case studies and we go AI, not AI. And we talk about the differences in using AI versus not using AI versus force fitting AI. So it's getting some smart people in your organization that either buy or rent that help you look at all your core systems and figure out what the opportunities are where AI can be applied, and also probably more importantly, where it shouldn't be applied. Almost every client that I have that's looking at the AI transformation, which is part of the digital transformation universe, that's an ill-defined concept that we're still playing with, but we're going to make things better and more automated, in essence. Call it digital transformation, whatever. They fail to look at, they show up with with pet systems that they want me to AI enable. In other words, we have logistics management, inventory control, and we think AI is going to have a big, and AI should be nowhere near those systems. They're transaction oriented. They don't need to make decisions. Having deterministic capabilities on these things is not necessarily going to have a core value. And it becomes contraindicated where AI is not going to be in that part of the system. They just don't understand it yet. They just think it's going to happen. So having someone look at what your transformation is, look at the larger architecture, look at where this technology can be applied and where it can't be applied. We did the same thing with cloud computing 15 years ago. Now everything's AI first. Well, guess what? 10, 15 years ago it was cloud first.
Yeah.
And where not every workload, not every data set needed to be in the cloud, maybe 30 to 40% would be the maximum that the enterprises needed to transform in the cloud. Yet everybody tried to make this mad dash into the cloud, move things into the cloud that should have been moved in the cloud, and now end up having huge amounts of technical debt that they have to deal with. They're spending, as much as 10 times operating those systems than they should be spending. Same thing with AI, but it's even more dangerous. That's 20 times, 30 times the cost of traditional environments. So in other words, if you're AI enabling something today, or using AI or force fitting AI, that's going to be a key technology within your applications, within your business domain, you're going to end up misapplying it. And you're ultimately going to build inefficiency in your systems, and you're just going to end up hemorrhaging cash. Because guess what? I can make all those things work. I always tell them, I can take your inventory system, I can enable it with AI. And I'm going to be able to make it work. But it's going to cost 10 times, 20 times more than your system is running now. And it's not going to return that much value because AI is not going to have a strategic impact for that particular system. So it's the ability to look at all that stuff. My biggest fear is people misapplying the technology, not getting the return on their investment, very much like did in the cloud computing stuff. And they're going to end up taking some of these businesses out because they're going to run up so much technical debt, misunderstanding, misapplying the technology, that they're going to end up, in ways where they don't have the resources to do the things that the business needs to do. So if you're spending money on one system, trying to AI enable it, that means other systems aren't going to be AI enabled that really should be. And I think the misallocation of the money and the resources to throw AI at everything in there is just a misapplication of the technology. Like I said in a video I did a couple of weeks ago, all the CEOs are running around AI first enterprise, got to do AI first. It's a bad strategy. It shouldn't be. It should be AI sometimes when you can justify it, and AI sometimes when you can pay for it. And I know I'm a big bummer when I say that, and kind of a buzzkill based on all the hype.
I don't
that's
think
going
so,
out in the
but keep going.
Yeah, in the market right now, but I think that's the reality of it. I know people don't want to hear it, but I think that message is starting to resonate with people.
Can you give us a verbal matrix? You mentioned in your architecture classes, you guys go through use cases and you're like, yes or no, AI. And you mentioned like logistics. Bad idea. Let's keep humans with that. You already have a deterministic system. Are there other ones that our audience, you can enlighten them on that? How do you come up with that, or areas that definitely don't bother with right now?
Typically things that are transaction, you got to look at each application and solution on its own merit. So you can't really, just profile it based on what it is. But normally systems that are very transaction oriented, that are they're making structured calls, they're not going to benefit from dynamic changing of decision making. In other words, the knowing and the understanding and building on the model, probabilistic stuff. And that would be an indication to me that it probably shouldn't be AI. I'd have to look at it in detail to see what they're wanting to do and some of the opportunities in the system. But if it's just a sales order entry system, I can certainly use AI to, track clients and, do the CRM stuff that's on the edges of that system. But as far as core to the system, probably doesn't need to be AI enabled because of what it isn't that complicated. And it's going to be good enough for what it's for. I'd rather take that money and spend it in other areas. Areas where, a good example would be, supply chain management. Typically, that may be a good use of AI because ultimately you're having dynamic understanding of the different supply chain characters, things that are out of your control, the suppliers, raw material, good producers, shipping, all that kind of stuff, which is going to be changing a lot over time. And you're going to have to make decisions and understand via the patterns in terms of what is going to be the most efficient way to build something, order from somebody, ship something, things like that. Normally something like that, AI is going to have a benefit. because number one, I'm putting in a decision-making entity, in this case, kind of a fake brain, that's able to make some tactical calls that normally humans would make about using different entities, using different suppliers. And so the complexity of that system would be mediated by an AI system. And it wouldn't be that I could do that with machine learning. I wouldn't have to use a generative AI to make that happen. So those are things, to kind of keep in mind. But you have to look at the core mission of the system, what it's capable of doing. And so we're, agentic versus non-agentic. That's even more fun to play that game. But ultimately, AI is very good at working with systems that need dynamic changes, need to change the behavior over time. In other words, adjust to changes in the environment, changes in state, changes in the data. Because if we have to do that as humans, and basically through the system and through some sort of automated system, we're not going to be able to do it as fast and efficient as AI. But that is probably maybe 30-40% of the systems that you have within your enterprise. And also you have to look up at the core and non-core stuff. In other words, is this application core to what we do, or is it some sort of an edge-based application? So if it's sales order entry, inventory control, shipping and logistics, that's core to the business. Okay, what is it doing? And typically we're not building AI in those things right now. So it's going to be more money and time to build that. However, if it has a justifiable use case where AI is going to be, of value, then we need to study it, figure out the architecture, create the logical architecture, and then map it into a physical architecture and see if it's something that we're going to be able to do and something we're able to build, and then guess the amount of value that it's going to be able to bring back to the business. And by the way, if it's going to be less than I think, then that may be a reason not to build it. And so I would move on and put my money in something else. So it has to be a game where we don't think we have a massive pile of money that's going to be unlimited. No one has a money tree in the back of the business. We have a certain pile of cash. We have to spend the cash in reasonable ways that are going to have the most value, strategic and tactical values to the business. And that means a lot of thinking in terms of how you're going to use it. One of the things that the AI vendors will come to me and they go, we're really frustrated with the adoption of AI is not occurring at the pace that we thought it was going to occur. What they heard a couple of years ago was that, well, you didn't hear it from me. And number one, they don't have a pile of money, guys. They're only able to spend 15% of their budget on IT. That's typically going to be best practice. That's not an unlimited funds, and they're not able to buy these systems that are 10, 20 times the cost of traditional environments. And they talk about, well, it's a strategic, they have to do it, get in and become competitive in the space. I get it. But what you're telling them to do is to spend massive amounts of cash on things that are very arbitrary, things that are very random. And so if they do that, they're going to make the wrong guesses. And they say, well, we don't see that happening. Look at cloud. And then they shut up. Say, and we have, we're back there trying to fix these things now. We do this with AI, you're going to kill those businesses. They're going to start hemorrhaging cash because the technical debt is not only just going to be 3 or 4 times, that of a traditional environment. It's going to be 20 to 30 times. And they're going to have to operate those systems, do so at scale, and they're not going to have the resources to put in other places where they should be spending the money. So think about that when you sell this stuff. And I don't think people are doing that now. Right now, it's a big party. I go to all the conferences. Everything's an agentic AI, a generative AI conference. A lot of cheerleading. Got to do this. Make it first. AI first. Enterprise and whatever. But it needs to be dumbed down a bit. Like I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, everybody needs to calm down and take a look at what the real value of this technology is for their particular use case. And many people think they already understand that, and they don't.
I would amen to that. I would agree wholeheartedly. Most people don't understand it. I guess, one area that I'll come about is, like you mentioned, there's things core to your business that you really have to look at on a case-by-case basis before you let the AI beast loose on it. But we see often customer service getting turned into an agentic AI or an AI chatbot of some kind. What are your thoughts on it? And before you respond, I'll say this, that to me, depending on the nature of your business, if it's human touch oriented and you lose that relationship with the end client to an automated robot, then I would argue you've actually lost something of significance to your organization. But it seems to be, we're just seeing it it's becoming ubiquitous, where a lot of companies are just killing off their phone people and saying, "Yeah, deal with the chatbot, man."
Yeah, in my architecture class, we're actually designing a employee-free company. It's going to have no employees, and actually, the hardest part of that, and just to say we did, the hardest part of that is the customer service element of it. Everything else is automatable. In other words, I can sell stuff, I can ship stuff, I can even track the shipment, things like that. I can use drop ship. I can figure out how to deal with the manufacturer. This is the case of a retail organization just selling somebody else's stuff. But I go, customer service, how are we going to do that? And I put that to the class, and that's actually the toughest thing to do. I told them, I said, if we're able to figure that out, that's core to this system. So I can certainly try to automate a lot of the customer service system using chatbots and IVR systems and things like that. And by the way, there is the ability for AI to add value in those situations because it's able to communicate with people with different dialects, different languages. It's able to send, customized videos to people that it's generated dynamically based on how it's going to solve their particular problem in their language, in their dialect, in ways in which they're going to understand, and even considering, who they are in their educational background. And all that stuff is available to you today, but you can't remove the human out of the loop. There has to be the ability to talk to a human to solve the issue. And you don't need as many humans if you do that, but that's always going to be the case. And people will argue with me. They say, well, AI can do this and this and this. I get it. I understand it has magical capabilities and we're able to do lots of stuff we couldn't do, 5 years ago with the same sort of a customer service system. But at the end of the day, there still has to be some human interaction or people are not going to like it. People hate AI. I always tell people that, who aren't out of the industry, they hate it. Okay. It's building data centers. They don't want the data centers there. It's taking jobs. They don't want their jobs taken. And now you're having them talk to a chatbot when they're trying to get their television fixed or their cable back on, things like that. And I do it all the time. I'm sure you do it all the time. Yep. You have to put some humanity in those things where you're able to get to a human being to solve many of those issues. And we're not going to be able to take the humans out of the loop unless we start dealing with non-humans, which we're never going to deal with. If we're dealing with robots, easy. But if we're dealing with humans, we have to have the capability to have someone with empathy solve their issues and basically find the solution to the problem. Now we can take them down a hierarchy. In other words, try to send the documents, try to help them digitally. And sometimes it's even better than waiting in a queue for someone to answer the phone. But eventually you got to have that human element in these systems that's going to keep the humans interested in that company. Anybody who adopts, I always tell people that I understand there's package systems you can buy that are complete AI driven customer service systems, and they're amazing. But when you launch one of those systems, people are going to hate you, and they're going to figure out pretty quickly that it's AI, and they're going to figure out pretty quickly that you don't care about them, you disrespect them, you're not going to respect their time. But if they're able to get with their answers better and quicker, it doesn't matter. It's the perception of the individuals. And I understand that's a big bummer as well, but the reality is you're selling to humans, and humans like dealing with other humans in some instances. And if they don't get that interaction, they're going to consider it a failed transaction. And that in these days when we have social media, Google ranking, all that kind of stuff, people are going to figure it out pretty quickly. If someone has bad customer service, you're going to know that pretty quickly. Cable TV, by the way, legendary bad customer service. People know that when they call in there. So they're already pre-disappointed when they start talking to those people. It's like dread calling into my, when my internet goes down, trying to get my internet back up again. So, excuse me, we have to take into consideration those things.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, because we see a lot of people who are the first thing they're throwing at it is customer service. We can take all our help desk support and just totally outsource it. And what we actually find is that there's a lot of, things that could be addressed by the FAQs. Yeah, throw an agent at it. But once you get beyond that, and there's a lot of it, and there's a lot of nuances, and people at that point want to talk to someone. They want to talk to a human being and get real intelligence, not artificial intelligence, to help them solve.
Yeah, they want to choose their own journey at least. And and by the way, I hate dealing with humans when I'm dealing with airline tickets and things like that. I like automated, use my app, use my the web page, things like that. But I'm choosing that journey. But if I chose to talk to a customer service agent, I should be able to do that. You got to remember, people are going to have different needs. Some people are visually focused, some people are auditory focused, some people want to deal with the written word and deal with chatbots, things like that. Sometimes I'm able to use the tools that they're able to provide me to find the answer quicker and easier, and probably in a cheaper way than talking to a human. But you're always going to have the human in the loop anytime you're dealing with any kind of a customer service or sales scenario. And people have a tendency to kind of brush that by. And I think people are over automating right now, and they're finding out quick that, number one, people hate AI. They're going to hate you for using it, and you're going to use a customer. I'm not picking on companies here, but there's case study after case study where they replaced their customer service with many of these chatbot based, customer service agents, and it blew up in their face. They had to hire the customer service agents back. And over and over again, I'm seeing that. And that's because they didn't anticipate the reaction in terms of what the humans were going to think, their customers were going to think about them using that automation. It's disrespectful at the very least. And their employees hate it. Their customers will hate it. And you're going to find your business has gone away. And I think somebody has a good case study out there. It's public now. I'm not going to pick on them, but they lost 20% of their customer base in a couple of months because they, put in this automation thing. And by the way, they announced the fact that they were going to do this automation. Their courses were going to be automated, and the customer service was going to be automated completely by AI. And, hey, look at us, how innovative we are. And everybody completely across the board panned it and unsubscribed from their service until they fixed it, and they backed up on it. We're seeing a lot of those things today. I just saw one study that talks about, many of these organizations are stepping back from many of the original predictions that they have in terms of how AI is going to impact their business, because they realize they can't do it in a time frame that they thought they could do it, and it's not going to have the impact they thought it was going to have. So they're dialing back the amount of value that AI stuff is actually going to be able to create. Now, the tech guys are going crazy about that because they're worried about them not buying their AI after they spent trillions of dollars in building the technology infrastructure. That's probably going to happen as well. But the reality is, who couldn't see that coming? We adopt technology very much in slower ways than we think we're going to adopt it. As cloud computing, the web, rise of service-oriented architecture, rise of the PC, all these little technological, innovations that we've been through is adopted at a much more slower pace than they think it's going to happen. Cloud computing, for example, when it first came out, Gartner said 80% of the workloads are going to be in the cloud in 1 year. I remember that report, and I brought it up and showed it on my video. And we're nowhere near that, maybe at 40% now, maybe 50 when you consider SaaS. And the reality is they can't move that fast. They can't spend that much money. And they didn't need to have all those workloads and all those data sets reside in the cloud. And people just got better understanding and better ideas. AI is going to be the same way.
So now, switching a little bit to agentic AI, how do you think that's going to change the way who the product is on the web? And let me give you an example. So I may not have asked that question properly. Today, when I go to Expedia, as an example, and I want to go book an airline ticket, I get shown 10,000 ads of various different kinds. And that's part of their way they make money. Now, if I program an agent to go and research the flights, go ahead and book my tickets, those ads suddenly have no value. In the old model, I am the product. Now you have an agent that might be doing some of this work, and it could care less what you're showing it or not showing it. Do you have any thoughts on how that might change the model on the web or in certain areas?
Yeah, you're going to have to change your model. And this is an example where agentic AI should be used. It's good at edge cases where it's looking for cheap flights. It's basically looking at a website or websites to figure out how the flights are trending up or down, cheaper hotel rooms, looking for real estate for you, trying to buy furniture, whatever. And we're able to do these pre-programmed things that are able to operate continuously and act proactively. So we're no longer dealing with the web as the interface. And that's the problem. If we're no longer dealing with the web, we're dealing with the applications, the agents are doing it on our behalf, then the agents are the ones who are going to see the ads and they're going to skip right by it. So guess what? You guys have to figure something else out. So we figured the fact that we could put ads up on every web page out there to, make some additional income, and the social media guys have to live off that. And that's something that's not going to go on in perpetuity. So eventually we're going to figure out how to abstract ourselves away from those interfaces. We're not going to see the ads, and they're not going to make money. And I'm not crying for them. They have to shift around and shift their models. But, lots of businesses are going to change because of the addition of this technology. Not that agentic is this, game changing stuff where everybody's going to, basically have agents run everything out there. McKinsey saying that 20% of his employees are agents. Come on, give me a break. But the ability to provide some more productivity opportunities for us by not having to go through the monotony of seeing these ads and be able to skip right by it. And so that we use automation to make our lives better. And we've been doing this for years. We're getting better at automation. The advertisement stuff is not going to be an issue. I mean, just like, podcast, if you don't want to give your ads on a podcast, there's automated system to remove the ads and just play the text. And some people want to consume information that way. And I think that's going to change some of the industries in the fact that the web stuff, even the software as a service systems, are finding an impact as well, because the agents are in essence abstracting the human beings away. And guess what? They're charging per seat. So instead of 1,000 people that are paying $90 per seat, they have 100 agents that are paying $100 per seat for each one of the agents, but they're doing the same amount of work. They're still dealing with the humans on the back end, but the agents are mitigating between them and the SaaS system. So if that abstraction is going to happen, we have to just adapt for it. We're not going to create a law that's going to, outlaw agents so people have to look at the web pages, see the ads.
Let's chat briefly before we run out of time about AI governance and security. I mean, those are two, we got AI, which is the wild, wild west right now. And this whole concept of governance, which can't possibly keep up with the rapid pace of changes that's taking place. But if a company is considering adopting AI in certain areas that could have PII or can end up disclosing data on the web, I mean, to me, this is really dangerous. If you created a data lake, remember those from way back when that had all this stuff in there, and you let AI loose on it, well, there's no delete function there, man. I mean, once that data is in there, it's going to answer stuff based on that information. What's a company to do? Most companies don't even know where their data is or what all that data is. So how do you handle that, David?
You have to be very aware of what data is being used to train your models, and understand that your models basically are functionally equivalent to a database. So, and by the way, you're absolutely right. So once it's trained on some of this data, it's going to be very difficult to pull the data out because that pattern's already been consumed and it's already been turned into 1,000 million different parameters. So just use your head in this. If it's training on data that is some sort of a data that has compliance, for example, healthcare data, PII being the big one, then you have to treat the model as also a recipient of PII information, including being aware of the law and what it says. And sometimes I think that's illegal for you to do that. Unless that is certified as a PII, a piece of technology, I can't remember the details, but you had to have a manager that's associated with it and all that kind of stuff. So we know what the rules are. We just have to understand how it applies to a new set of technology. And when you train a knowledge model, it's nothing more than reading the data and turning it into parameters. And so we're going to assume that the knowledge model is going to be recipient and container of the data. And if that data is under some of the compliance, you have to deal with it. We have to deal with governance in the data side. In other words, dealing with compliance and how we're dealing with databases. That same stuff has to exist on the knowledge side. And it's going to be a replication or a copying of the data, and you're going to have to basically deal with it, deal with it as such. And people always say we're going to use less governance people and, security people now that we're going into AI. No, you're going to need twice as many. I can't. Every time I map out a project and look at the operational impact, in other words, operationalize the systems we're building, there's always going to be twice as many security people and twice as many governance people as they currently have, just because of the problems you just mentioned. So those things have to be governed. Those have to be planned. Those things have to be managed. And the way in which you govern a model is going to be very different than the way in which you governing a database.
Absolutely. And I think that point is lost on a lot of people. the governance of the model versus governance of people. I think it's much easier to govern people. And especially when you look at some of the models as they are evolving and they're able to, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? They're able to break the boundaries that you might have laid out for them. So you've told it the prime directive of solving this problem, but to solve that problem, it has to go past the boundary that you may have set for it. And it's not intelligent, but it has enough pattern recognition to know I'm going to go do that anyways.
It
now
does.
You got a problem.
I had a case years ago when I was doing a system for a company that had an NIH grant, and we had anonymized data. In other words, data that came from patient outcomes that did not have PII information associated with it. We uploaded it into a model, and guess what? The model figured out how it could backfill the PII information and had a 95% success rate in going out on the open internet and figuring out who those people were, brought it into the system. So when I looked at it, suddenly this thing's out of compliance, guys. You can't have PII information here. No one entered it in. They just add the command, can you match up the data, with existing known populations out there? And they didn't even know it was going to do that, and went ahead and carried it out, and was able to figure out, like, it had access to the web and access to patient records and patient databases, able to figure out, that this information was there, and suddenly they violated the law. Someone got arrested for that. Those sorts of things are going to happen all over the place because people, just the same thing with agents, are deleting the data and they're doing, dumb things because they're not putting governance and thinking around, setting these things loose. You got to remember, AI has dynamic behavior. It changes around stimulus. It's able to learn. It's able to adjust. It's able to, figure things out and get better and better and better at what it does. That's why we're using it. However, that same getting better can be weaponized against you if you don't figure out how to put governance around that. And I don't think people have a clue in how that's going to be done. In other words, they're looking at, we know how to do it within the data, keeping PI information at legal data compliance, governance, things like that. Within the knowledge model, I don't think you have a clue how to govern those things. And I just wrote a book on governance with Unlocking the Power of Cloud. And myself and my co-author, Meredith Stein, we talked about that, the ability to kind of put these processes in place, create a culture, and looking at the tools and technology, they're able to do it. And it is not an easy thing to do. It's a complex array of things. You have to deal with something at the knowledge level. You have to figure out the future dynamic nature of the model, how it's going to change itself over time, and the ability to put limitations on that growth. And that's something people have a trouble thinking about. We're used to dealing with static things that unless we change it, it's not going to change.
Right.
AI is completely different.
I'll have to pick up a copy of your book there. That sounds like an interesting read, because that problem is a very real one. And, in a lot of small businesses where we're just seeing I kid you not, Microsoft's putting up the pop-up, are you okay with letting Copilot be active? And then you say yes, and it says, are you authorized by your company to allow this action? Yes. And the person clicking that has no idea what that thing's about to go do. And before you know it, now you let Copilot loose like that, you can actually search up what somebody else's income is in the company. I can't make that up. That's real.
No, it's true.
Real story. It happened.
Yeah, and they charge you for the privilege. Yeah, Copilot became something that Microsoft has to undo. One of many things.
But it's very dangerous to turn those on just like that. And especially if your data is not segmented, your network's not segmented, you don't know exactly what. You got to be really focused with these things. I guess it's like anything else. It's a need to know basis is maybe the best way to deal with AI. Does it need to know? And if
That's
it doesn't,
right. And I think even dumbing down some of this AI, enthusiasm, instead of using large language models all the time, which we're doing now, even to run agents, but the ability to use very narrowly focused small language models, because they're not going to be as dangerous and they're much more easy to govern. And by the way, I can build those in an hour, for 11 cents of cloud computing time, where an LLM takes a month and takes $100 million of cloud computing time. So it's overly focused, overly using, overly trusting that's causing the issues. We're throwing everything in an LLM right now, and it's really kind of never meant to do that. The people who built the LLMs, they didn't really design them to do that. They designed them to be prompt and API access, to do very tactical things. And what companies are doing is they're pushing everything into a frontier model. And that's not what they're designed to do. And that's where the danger occurs. In other words, you're putting up in a shared space, it's going to be owned infrastructure owned by somebody else, maintained by somebody else. And somebody else may have the capability of seeing it, but you haven't really done the auditing to figure out how that's going to work. You just realize it's very easy for you to drag and drop your database, into ChatGPT, and then ask questions of ChatGPT about the data. And I know it works very well, but how many things did you violate? How much security, parameters have you violated? And by the way, we catch people doing that all the time. In other words, yeah, I mean, because they go, well, they were told to use ChatGPT and, use it efficiently. And so we're not putting, client data in there and things like that. There was no thinking and no checking with the security folks. And the CISO didn't know anything about it. That's because everybody has access to these tools that are working in productivity type tasks that are running on their desktops. Everybody uses it every day. Everybody's automating their stuff because it's an easy way to, work a 8-hour day in 2 hours. And then they're violating many of the security rules because there's a lack of training, a lack of culture to understand what they're doing. And that has to be first and foremost. So if you're going to use these tools, which I encourage people to use, I want you to be productive. There has to be some understanding in terms of the security issues that you're going to be dealing with. And it's at an epidemic proportion now. All these shadow AI stuffs are killing us, very much like the shadow cloud was 15 years ago. People are uploading a lot of the corporate data into the cloud providers. It's worse in the AI system because you're dealing with a co-located knowledge model. In other words, it's a single knowledge model that everybody's using. You're in essence having a certain namespace in there that you're going to be operating within, but you don't know how the data is being handled. You don't know how it's being backed up. You don't know how it's being dealt with. And you don't know, by the way, and I think this is actually the case, if the model is going to train itself on the data you're uploading. I would. I train myself on any kind of data I'm exposed to where I'm building a model. So suddenly they're going to be trained on the corporate data, including the salaries of your CEOs. And so someone types, in ChatGPT in a couple of months, what does Don CEO make? And hey, he makes $1 million a year. How did he know that? Well, that didn't come out of the 10Q. It came out of the data someone was stupid enough to upload.
And on that note, David, we're actually at the hour. We'd love to give you a couple minutes to plug whatever you'd like our audience to know about.
Yeah, easy to find. Check me out on LinkedIn, out on X. Also, 2 YouTube channels, Cloud Computing Insider and Dave Linthicum is Not AI. You can find those on YouTube. Check me out.
Fantastic. David, we didn't get through all the questions, but I knew that was going to happen. But it was fantastic having you as a guest. Please stay in touch, and we'll look forward to seeing you sometime in the future as the AI world evolves to keep us enlightened on all the core topics that are going on.
You got it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Take care.